Hello everybody and welcome to this month's Specifying Practice Group. I want to remind everybody again that our thought leaders are Dave Stutzman and Louis Metcalf. Dave is a registered architect, certified construction specifier, and founding principal at Conspectus, a specifications and quality assurance consulting firm. Louis is an architect, certified construction specifier. Louis manages the specifications and quality assurance programs for Gresham Smith & Partners, a national architecture, engineering, interiors, and planning firm out of the Nashville area. So with that, I want to hand it over to Dave and Louis to get started with today's presentation and go on, I guess, from the next step. In the last 2 months, we had talked about the past and present of specs, and now we've moved on to the future. So let's see what we can all plan to do tomorrow, I guess. Dave and Louis, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Matt. This is Dave. I'm coming to you today again from the road in downtown Philadelphia with my friend joining me here today, Chuck Rutterow. I'm in the Stantec's office, and we'll be getting to Chuck about a third of the way through the presentation. Chuck's the national or the corporate, I guess, practice leader for implementing BIM at Stantec, and he's got a different kind of perspective coming at specifications as part of data rather than just as documents. So looking forward to having Chuck present his information today. And Louis, how are you doing there in Nashville today?
Well, fine. It's a trifle rainy, but we're having the Country Music Association Fan Fest this week, and streets are closed down, and there's thousands of people out on the street having fun listening to live bands and music. So things are a lot of fun here in Nashville.
Oh, good, good. Well, as Matt said, today the presentation that we want to go over with is the future specifications. And here's my premise that I want you to keep in mind as we go through today, because if you think you know it today, tomorrow it's going to be irrelevant. Even if we can imagine what's going to happen 20 years out from now, if we can get out that far, before we get to 10 years, that'll probably be irrelevant. So, Matt, maybe we should start the program off today with the first polling question. Let's see how people are trying to use BIM today.
Because the big thing that is looming over all of us is implementing BIM and linking specifications in BIM. We all know that that's the future. The only question is, how's that going to happen? How soon is it going to happen? And what does that mean to specifiers and to the general practice? So we thought we'd kind of take a straw poll here and see how people are using it.
Okay, well, hovering around 75–80% for visualization and construction documents. That is not a surprise to me. I'm actually surprised, perhaps, that it's not more in the visualization. But I'll be interested to see what Chuck has to present about this, because I think he's got a whole different perspective. I'm not going to give that one away. Sorry, Chuck, you're going to be on your own trying to explain that one. All right. So future specifications, the one thing that I wanted to do is just suggest that this may lead to a brand new opportunity for specifiers, and I'll put it in the middle there as the information manager, rather than producing particular kinds of documents, but it may be actually trying to help the data, that whether it resides in a BIM or Revit model or supports a model as external data, I think it could open up a brand new role for us old-timers that are still producing specification books.
A couple of years ago, we had a presentation at the on the future specifications on the subject at the CSI convention, and there were three of us that spoke. I spoke on the subject of the future of the specifier, and that was my emphasis, is that seeing the specifier as being the information manager, not just a person who writes the specs and edits them and gets them out the door, but someone who is learning how to manage all the information that is necessary for the project. And to do that, I think we're going to have to learn some new skills. We're going to have to learn some new concepts about information science, information management, and that go well beyond just the 4 C's of writing specs and learning how to be terse and learning how to read product data to write a specification section.
Okay, but here to me is what's really sort of exciting and scary at the same time, because the world that we're living in, if we try to perceive what's going on in our own world, the growth we see in this industry really is pretty much linear, that we're going to start with what we know today and what we think we're going to know 5 years from now, and the path between that is, in our perception, I think fairly linear. But I think in the big picture, it's not even close. Not even close. Because if you look where we were only 20 years ago compared to today, if you can remember back that far, and Lewis, I know you and I can't. I don't know if anybody in the audience can. But we've come a long way.
Well, I remember drawing borders on drawing sheets with a ruling pen and lettering the title blocks with a Leroy machine. So I guess that qualifies me for dinosaurhood.
I guess so. I won't tell you that I still have my slide rule in my drawer.
I have one of those, yes.
But I want to say that even though what we're perceiving today is linear, I really believe this growth is exponential. And I think if you stop and think about this, you'll tend to agree. But the scary part is not just that it's an exponential growth, but even the rate of growth is exponential. That is what is truly scary. Now, I've been reading recently an article, and it was one that I just happened to stumble upon, written by Ray Kurzweil, and it's a very interesting read, and it talks about the technology and technology as it relates to biometrics and how both biologic and technologic systems are advancing, essentially following the same kind of model. And Ray is the one that's actually proposing that the rate of change is actually exponential, that if you plot the changes, for instance, computing power based upon cost per, say, 1,000 computing elements, whatever measurements you might be looking at, calculations per second, for instance, that the cost is decreasing exponentially. And along with that, the advancements in technology are increasing exponentially, but the rate of that change is also increasing exponentially. So if you plot the change on an exponential scale, a logarithmic scale, that plot is actually a hyperbola. So that it's showing that it's an exponential change. And we think that once we get to a point, for instance, BIM in modeling in software, that we may reach a capacity. But once we get to that capacity, then there's a complete paradigm shift as to how you're going to deal with the data and how you're going to deal with producing information for this industry. And that shift is what's going to drive then the next round of exponential growth.
We have a comment from Mary Noe who says, I discovered some surprising drawing errors. BIM seems to remove the CAD architect from the physical reality of what they are drawing, and perhaps Chuck will address that a little bit later when he comes online in his part of the presentation.
Well, he'll be up here soon. We're going to turn it over to him right after this. How many of these things do you recognize, Lewis, and how many of these do you consider obsolete?
Well, you left off the mimeograph machine.
I wasn't going to go back that far.
All right.
Sorry.
Of course.
But maybe you can explain this information diagram.
Here is that in the old days, what we had to do was every time we started a new phase, we basically threw everything away and started over. I can remember as a co-op student back in the 60s, the big argument was should the project teams try to salvage the schematic drawing floor plans and do heavy erasing on them to make them into DDs, or just simply throw them away and start over. But that's the concept, is that in the past we were not able to capture the information from one phase and reuse it in the next phase in a direct manner.
Okay, notice one thing I have on here, paper publishing, drawings and specifications, obsolete.
Absolutely.
We're still producing it, but it's obsolete technology. Software, pretty much obsolete. Who cares about software? We're all going to be cloud computing.
John O'Neill reminds us to remember the burster for use in separating continuous form paper at the perforations.
I used a shear for that. I never tore it apart.
The old computer paper that had the alternating green and white lines and the holes punched in the edges that you had to, and the margins that you had to tear off.
Yeah. So anyhow, what I want to do at this point, now that we've talked about all the obsolete things and made ourselves feel really good about all the things that we're still doing, I want to turn it over to Chuck, and what I want to explain is Stantec, and I've been working with Chuck now for a lot of years. I work with a lot of firms that are implementing BIM, and I will tell you that Stantec and my friend Chuck are the only ones that I'm dealing with that truly understand BIM is data. It is not graphics, it is data. It just happens to have a graphic interface to try to keep everybody.
Well, when you come to Nashville, I'll introduce you to the practice technology guys that sit adjacent to me at my office.
Okay, I don't know what that means exactly, but I'm sure it'll be a treat. Okay, so anyhow, here's Chuck, corporate BIM practice leader for Stantec. Welcome, Chuck. I'm glad you could join us.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks for the kind words. So what I want to do, and it's going to tie into what David was talking about, is kind of project out and look at the future of BIM. And as Dave said, I kind of have two hats that I wear here at Stantec, and one is I lead our BIM Management Solutions group, which does BIM consulting for owners who are looking to implement BIM, and then also corporately a strategic leader and a practice leader that helps part of our corporate team implement strategies on major projects and kind of push innovation through projects throughout the company. So before we look at the future, I kind of want to start by laying the foundation of what our view of BIM is. And, you know, you can get in definitions that are very specific, that BIM is 3D parametric modeling. But I really want to take a step back and really evaluate what it is. And then the other question you have to ask yourself is BIM an evolution or a revolution, which would have been a good poll question. But these are the types of things that I'm going to talk about right now. So to start this, what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at the evolution of a technology, and I'm going to look at transportation to start with. And what this graph shows is, it kind of started with animals and technology progressed all the way till we got to the early car and modern cars. Now, what I want to do is kind of overlay with this the evolution of drafting. And, if you look at the words that are above the pictures, you could start with all the way back from cave drawings to inking canvas to plastic mylar to the early cars, AutoCAD. But the next question is the modern car BIM? And my answer to that is no. If you're going to follow the logic progression, BIM is an airplane, and it's because it's a new process. And I think with the different offices, even within our own organization that are struggling with implementing BIM, they kind of miss this point. And what we see is that people, let's get to the next slide here, are trying to force BIM to do something that it's not meant to do. And when you do that, you just from the graphic here, you can see the kind of inherent problems that come along with that. So what we like to say is BIM is a new process, and it's a new technology-driven process. And when you put those two things together, it's very powerful. And I'm going to show another example in a minute of another industry that kind of went through a similar transformation that we're going through, where technology and process revolutionized how they deliver their services. And again, the most important thing, and I like to use the analogy, is it's the wings on the airplane that make it a different process. So in going from a CAD to a BIM scenario, it's the data integration that makes BIM a different process than CAD. Not an evolution of CAD, it's a whole new process. And to follow the analogy through, that when you embrace that new process fully, you can get from one place much quicker. So you can fly, instead of driving from Philadelphia to California and it takes a week, if you really use the process right, you can get there in basically a couple hours. So here's another big part of this process change, and that the drawing for hundreds of years, the process of architecture has been about creating drawings. It was the process. Well, with BIM, the drawings are the result of a process now. In an ideal BIM scenario, you're going to apply data and modeling, and at the end of the day, you hit a button, and the drawings are going to be a byproduct of that. And then the same can be said about specifications in that manner. That they're going to be a byproduct of what this new process is. So kind of where I say here we are today, and I think firms that really understand BIM and are kind of getting the whole data concept, this is a pretty reasonable place to be. And you focus on the information in BIM, the I, and you're going to have your 3D elements in the model start to be able to generate things like reports and be able to generate the drawings for the construction set and be able to generate a room data sheet. This is kind of I think, where the industry is trying to get. And I feel that we've done a pretty good job in our office of getting to this state. But this is only the start of I'm calling it BIM version 1.0 of where we can be. So what I want to do is start to look at this next analogy of the music industry and how they went through a process, a technology, and a process change. And kind of the way I look at this is there's basic needs that we all have. In this analogy, the basic need is I want to listen to music. In the design profession, it's an owner needs a building. And what we really need to do is reevaluate the process of how we deliver that basic need. And and I think we all need to be challenging ourselves on how do we improve that process. So to use this example, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this was the process you would go through if you wanted to buy a song to listen to it. You would drive to the store, you would look for the album, you'd have to purchase the album, you'd drive home before you could finally come home and listen to the song. And when you really evaluate what happened to that process, there's a lot of hidden costs and time that has nothing to do with what your basic goal was. You wanted to listen to a song, and there's some of these are really significant. I mean, even for the purchase of the album, the cost of the packaging, the fabrication, the rent of the store, the salaries of the staff, the energy costs, the shipping, a lot of hitting costs. So what changed that? iTunes, right? What they did is they leveraged technology with a new process and came up with a new way to deliver that basic need. And kind of the other point I want to make, because I have the record and the tape and all that at the top, that was just technology, improvements in technology, but not a change in process. So it didn't have the major impact it did, that iTunes did, when they actually said, we're going to leverage our technology and come up with a whole new process and a whole new delivery method. And again, all of that went away and became a bunch of ones and zeros and numbers and data that was being transferred. And the thing, and this is why I think as a design professional, we need to be challenging ourselves to think in this way of how we're going to leverage this technology and process, because I think our owners and our market is demanding that, and I think we're seeing that in the way fees are being reduced, right? It's all a result of what the market is looking for. And if you're not careful and you don't kind of keep up with the technology, and how do we deliver the basic need in the most efficient fashion, this was the result of what happened to iTunes. A lot of stores went out of business because they became obsolete. So I'm going to go back to this diagram and say this is kind of where we are today. We can have models that are loaded with data and generate reports. I'm kind of going to look forward to, well, what's the next step? And where do we go to kind of make ourselves into iTunes? And the first thing I'm going to show is this concept of a design database. This is something that Dave and I have been talking about a lot of years, and it kind of just came up in a conversation before. This is a database of that preliminary project description, if I were going to turn it back into a specification question, right? It's all the parameters you have based on a project type. So when you go to start a medical office building, and this is kind of the other thing that we've realized in the CAD world, we're all used to having our libraries of CAD blocks. Well, in the BIM world, you're going to have your libraries of families, which are your modeled elements, but you're also going to have your data library, which applies, right? It's what makes BIM different. So your specifications for different building types, your parameters for certain rooms, your room data sheets, all that is the beginning part of it. And I think where we're trying to get is the goal of saying, if we're going to do this project type, we're going to access our database. That data is going to be there, and we're going to model based on that, or have it even inform our models, and then produce our documentation. So that's kind of one step. I'm calling that BIM version 2.0.
So we're going to specify the buildings without having to draw them.
Yes. At the beginning, and what you're establishing is the parameters for the project, and that first design base. I mean, could be a cost database with that also. That you're establishing the budget, all that before you start to do the project, and then as the project is developing, you can always compare back to the original database just to make sure you're on target, right? If we said we're going to have 15 of these rooms, well, we know the model has 15, we're good. We said this room type is going to have 4 receptacles. Let's check our original criteria. It does. We're good. Move on to what I'm calling BIM 3.0, which is automation, to where you take this BIM information and, again, turn it into a bunch of ones and zeros that a cost database can understand and generate, the costing information. And then that information can lead into fabrication. So this is kind of like a big vision of it. I like to use this diagram to kind of show what this concept means. And what it means is ideally, again, what we're trying to strive for is a consistent database through the life cycle of the project. And in this diagram, the blue bar in the middle kind of represents that data and how it starts through the concept phase, and how the top red block might be that first set of building standards based on the building type you're doing, the development of the model. It all feeds into that database. That database is consumable by the cost estimating software. As the project develops, that same database is informing the fabrication, and you could even take another block at the end of this and say that same database is going to inform the facility management software system that an owner is going to have. So kind of, I think, when we have that full data integration, which I'm calling BIM 4.0, is kind of, our end game for where we want to be within the next couple of years.
So playing into this, Chuck and Lewis, specifications and drawings don't even matter. I mean, the books and the drawing pages that we're producing are irrelevant.
I agree, or they will be shortly, because that's the process. Technology doesn't need the drawing; it only needs the data. And I think what's going to happen is there's going to be smarter things that are going to read the data, and we're really going to be the only ones that need to look at the drawings. And I think it's going to be more of, you're going to have a mobile device and you're going to access the model and you're going to look at the parts you want, rather than having a huge set of drawings that is mostly wrong. Or
Mostly wrong.
The problem is, though, at the present time, we have to figure out some method of documenting the contractual obligations of the design team and the construction team to the owner, so that the owner knows what it's getting for its money. And at the moment, we're kind of limited on that. We have to export from this wonderful database drawings and specifications that can be physically stamped or electronically stamped, that show what is the definitive instruments of service from which the stuff will be built.
Right, but Lewis, you got to think 25 years from now.
Oh, I am. I'm just saying that right now that is a hurdle that we've got to solve, and that's one of the things
I kind of liken that to you buy a song on iTunes and then they mail you a CD of it just to be sure. That's kind of the analogy I use for that. But I think what we're doing is looking for ways to how we can most efficiently produce the minimum documentation required to meet authority having jurisdiction review and to meet the contractual obligations, and putting it in the right sequence. That's kind of our intermediate step right now.
Well, and with the steps that IG or ICC are taking with the electronic review, I think we're already moving in that direction, that there may come a time when they no longer accept paper documents. All they want is electronic.
Indeed, but of course there's always the issue that is there information in those documents that goes beyond what we really want them to build at this time. That is to say, preliminary information, or whatever. We have a couple of comments from the audience that I'd like to get caught up on. Clifford says that AIA documents will soon be obsolete. Just the whole process, of course. Larry Whitlock says, I recently attended a presentation about the integrated project delivery process used for a small behavioral health care facility. The architect stated the selection of materials was a collaborative process with the owner and a contractor, which resulted in his not having to provide any specifications. Do you see this process being the next step in the evolution of architectural services? And going along with that, Glenn Gray asks, BIM can include Part 2 information, but how about Part 1 and Part 3? We are going to talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, but perhaps, Chuck, you'd like to take a first stab at those questions or those comments?
I mean, I definitely think the role is going to change. And I think it's going to be, the biggest changes is going to be the labor is going to go, right? So it's not going to be about drawing, it's going to be about design, and it's going to be about validation. That's where I really see the role of the architect being, is kind of, because I think a lot of the drawing production and a lot of that stuff is just going to be, more of an automatic process, and it's going to be, I think it's going to be more reviewing, making sure that what's going to happen is that the CD process is going to go away, and you're going to be going direct to fabrication, and it's going to be more making sure that the fabrication information is in alignment with what that original project scope was, that we talked about at the beginning of that preliminary project description, and kind of being the person making sure that that's staying on track.
Almost more, from our standpoint in the U.S., almost an international approach where the design architect is responsible for the design, and at that point the contractor is really responsible to create the construction drawings, oftentimes.
We do work my firm does work in China, and one of the interesting things about practice over there is that the architect of record is not even permitted to write specifications, that those are done by the owner. And so there's quite a different, just a whole different way of thinking about it. But I think what Larry was talking about in terms of the selection of materials being a collaborative process, but with the designer, owner, and contractor coming to agreement, ultimately that's the purpose of specifications, is to establish a written agreement between the three stakeholders or the parties, that they agree that these are the products that will be used to build the building. And so yes, there's a sense in which, in which we document those decisions, but having to write the traditional specifications where we can hold the contractor's feet to the fire when necessary may be something that passes away. A couple more comments I want to read. Dave Jackson says regarding your chart, looks like it would be great for a mass-produced item in a factory as opposed to a unique one-off custom designed building. Would you like to respond to that, Chuck?
Sure. I think it's both, right? I think there's always going to be the client, and I kind of like put this toward like a family portrait, right? There's always going to be someone that wants to have a hand-painted family portrait done of their family, right? And there's always going to be a sector that wants buildings like a museum that has, it's a custom design, everything is special, high-end, eerie type building, right? But then there's going to be a market that wants to have more speed and efficiency and is going to be willing to take a little more prefabrication and standardization to get their buildings in time. That's going to be probably the larger middle group. And then there's going to be the third group, which we call fast food architecture, who just are going to want to order off a menu and have it show up on the site. So I think there's certain levels to that. And I think the market, again, is going to demand, some owners, and we're starting to see this, are willing to give up a little bit in the customization of a building to gain in speed and efficiency.
Well, it's taking the concept of standard details a few steps further. I mean, we all have had standard details forever, and it's just taking that concept a little bit further and saying, are there some basic kit of parts for exterior walls of different natures that we can arrange in different configurations to enclose spaces of different sizes and shapes and finishes. A couple
with
more.
The data,
Yes.
Louis, here's a thought for you.
Okay.
To put you go over the edge. Okay, what happens when we reach singularity and man becomes machine, or machine becomes man, and we no longer even need the buildings because we just plug into the machine and experience the virtual world without even having to have it as a physical entity.
Welcome to the Matrix. Dave Metzger writes. That's true. Yes, I believe that virtual reality may soon become the drug of choice. And I don't know if you've read any of the science fiction stories by Larry Niven about the guys who have direct implants into their brains and they live inside this other world rather than in what you and I would call the real world. Dave Metzger says, buildings are more than merely an assembly of components and materials. Architects and specifiers are by their nature generalists, that is to say, integrators of the components. For me, a basic principle is that systems are not panaceas, and there will always be the need for people with experience and good judgment. In other words, somebody wants to look at the stuff that comes out of the machine after we push the button before we actually let it go out on the street.
That would be a fine idea, at least for the moment.
Tommy Smith says we are presently 30 years behind the laws in the laws, and BIM is 20 years ahead, and so that is a differential of 50 years. Dave Metzger has another comment. He says buildings are more no, that's a repeat. I'm sorry. Ron Lincoln says Part 2 products, Leda, semi-gloss, red for paint, are largely data. But how do you treat Part 3 execution, sand metals lightly between coats and reapply to cover? Now, as we are going to talk about that a little bit later, but those are the questions that we need to ask about what information goes in the model and what may have to be documented in a different format. Michael McVitie asks, is Stantec deploying SQL or similar to create the adjunct database to the model? I assume he means for specification type information.
We've been looking at various database type applications, whether it's SQL or Oracle, but the answer is yes.
Okay. David Trudell says the analogy of the music industry to the building design and construction is a little difficult to accept. One song recorded on a medium versus one building designed and built is quite different. I think the point that Chuck was trying to make is that the innovations are going to come not so much from robots building our buildings or new products, although there are lots of those, but it is the way that we think about delivering a construction project. Is that a fair thing to say, Chuck?
Correct. And again, just challenging the notion of, I'm sure there was a time when someone would have said there's no way we could listen to music without CDs. I'm just kind of throwing it out there that you might want to think that there's going to be a time when the drawings aren't there.
Well, I have sometimes amused some of the younger folks here at work when I ask them, do you know why they call a CD an album? And when I explain that when I was a little boy, my father had several record albums that looked like photograph albums and had these big 78 discs in there that could only play a few minutes of a symphony on one side, then they begin to understand is that those words get hung over from technology that's completely outmoded. And so in addition to having new technology, we need to have a new language and a whole new way of thinking about it. And that's one of the things that has come about in the music industry. And in an analogy, in the AEC industry, we need to have the same kind of revolution. And one more, Dave Metzger says, how far off is the day when buildings are constructed using 3D printers? That'd be a pretty good sized printer, David.
I was going to put a slide in about that, but that could be the next big thing after this. That you really, 3D printing and they could be printing construction materials. Who knows? But I think that's kind of the next big.
As a matter of fact, just this week, I had a sales rep call on me from Wausau, a curtain wall manufacturer, and he showed me some custom mullions covers to try for fitting into historic renovation projects or one thing and another that were done with a 3D printer. That where before, if they wanted to do a custom extrusion, it would take weeks and weeks. It was thousands of dollars, but they can run these things out, in nothing flat, and if you don't like it, they'll try a different one.
Right, and if you think about it, Louis, I had the opportunity in helping out at Fort Leonard County in Maryland and trying to do some master planning for them. At the time, the Foreign Systems group there was actually modeling foreign armaments that they would capture so that they could do radar signals. signatures so that they were building by 3D printing in 1990. And today we're looking at 3D printing as a new technology. It's been around. And we're just not having used it in building construction. Things like the auto industry have been using it for years. Think about side rear view mirrors and the casings that go around that. That's all of the molding for that's coming out of 3D printing. So, I mean, it's just a matter of how quickly does some of this stuff get implemented and we start realizing where it's come from, and you know, just imagining new applications for the technology that's available. So, shall we press on?
Okay.
Chuck, are you about here? Or,
yeah, I mean, it's my last closing slide is I always encourage, this should be a time of innovation, and this is what I really encourage all our people in our office here when it comes to BIM is, don't look at it as trying to drive a plane on a highway, let's get a new process, let's figure out every project, set a goal for innovation, and try and achieve it. So, and that, I'm done.
Let's drive the airplane in the sky.
So we go back to you, Louis?
Okay.
Find the right, there we are.
If you can find me.
I can find you. All right.
Okay. So what's the next slide there? Oh, this one is yours.
Well, we talked about the matrix, right? Hey, and there it is. I mean, we're really talking, the stuff that Chuck was just presenting, it's really talking about data.
Well, let's go on and
data,
talk about the difference. Let's talk about the difference between. Oh, okay. I forgot this one. So this is a little conceptual diagram here to show that the ideal, instead of being beads on a stream, are the small tributary streams that are feeding information in, so that it builds on itself and you're not starting over continuously. And a major factor in that is collaboration, as has already been pointed out, making decisions in conjunction in real time with the owner and the contractor, and coming to agreements about what products are going to be used and what systems are going to be used in the new facility that's being designed. And of course, the universal access from anywhere with any device. People are already doing a lot of that. My firm has got people with tablet computers running around doing their punch lists and being able to look at the drawings remotely using project information management software.
Okay. You were looking to get another poll question in here, as I remember.
Oh, yes.
You want to put up the very
actually, it's the last one. It's the last question. Number 4. And of course, this is the question that a couple of our attendees have brought up, is what, and that's the whole question, is what information is going to be in BIM and what's going to be in a different format. So let's see how we're coming with this poll. Okay, we're getting a majority thinking that all of these things can be attached in the BIM, in the model itself.
Now, there's really no clear leader except for maybe fabrication requirements, just by a very slim margin.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go back to the next slide, and I want to talk a little bit about the distinction between oops, go backwards one. Data and information.
There?
Yes.
Okay.
This is a mantra that I've been singing for the last 15 years, well before people started even thinking about BIM, is that even when we were drawing with CAD, or really even when we were drawing with pencils on paper, we're really in the information business. Drawings are just a method, that we use to communicate the ideas that we have and the requirements for building a given facility. And so I've this little formula here, data plus structure equals information. And structure is what CSI has been good at over the years. We have master format, section format, page format. All of those have contributed greatly to people being able to store data quickly and accurately, and then be able to retrieve it quickly and accurately. And our two preceding sessions here in the specifying practice group have been all about the history of that. It's how that developed and how people finally started working together to come up with common standards for that information. But let's go a little further and define what each of these terms mean. Let's look at data.
It's not cooperating. There we go.
And that's the raw stuff, the raw information or parameters, prior decisions that are imposed by the outside entities or forces, namely the owner, or code requirements. And the next one, please. Yes?
Those are the zeros and ones.
You might say that. It's the raw bits. And then the structure, in this context, means how do we organize components to achieve some specific purpose. And then let's go on to information.
All right, but don't you think that a lot of that, though, Louis, ultimately, you mentioned master format and uniformat. Some of those formatting structures really they're there only because as humans we need some way to be able to comprehend the data. If we're relying on machines to analyze the data, those kinds of formats also become irrelevant because we can devise very complex algorithms that a machine can handle that we as humans cannot.
Well, yes and no. All of the machines have to have some sort of information, and there's a diagram at the very end of this presentation that you kindly included that shows that, for example, uniformat and master format are two structured queries of the same data. But we query the data to create different types or forms of information. And in this context, I think we can define information as knowledge used for reasoning or action. And that's what we're after. So we're getting kind of close to the end here. So the discussion is, well, where should this information go? And for what purposes? And if we look at the three, go to the next slide, please.
Sure.
At the three basic stakeholders, we see that they have different purposes. The designer information is basically creating procurement requirements to achieve certain work results, and there's a list there of bulleted items. I'm not going to read those, and that's our purpose. So the constructor information is somewhat different. Their goal is to achieve the work results for which they contract with the owner to provide. And so the information is quite different. And right now we have the case where in many instances contractors, even though the owner, the architect and engineer may make the BIM available to the contractor, we often find contractors actually re-entering the information so that they can weed out the stuff that's irrelevant to them, that they don't need, and to add the additional information that they do need for scheduling, site usage, concealed space allotment, and so forth, as well as starting to store the information that the owner is going to want for facilities management. And let's go to that one.
One thing you've done here, Louis, is that you're approaching this on a more traditional design bid build basis. What happens if you merge designer and constructor?
Well, again, even if we merge the entities, I think the different categories of information are still a legitimate way of thinking about it because there are different purposes involved. We have, in one sense of the word, the design documents are kind of the booster rocket to get the thing into orbit. Or I should say, get the project off the ground or out of the ground. But let's go on to the owner information.
All right.
And here, what we're after is the ultimate end of all of this is improvements to real property, which we might call resultant work. But now the owner, a lot of the information that was created by the design team is irrelevant. They don't care about submittals once the building is open and operating. What they do care about is what brand of sealant was used in the exterior walls, what's the operating capacity of the chillers and the brand name, what's the warranty information, and that sort of information. So what I'm saying is that we talk about all of this information being in BIM, but there are really conflicting and competing types of information that have to compete in one sense of the word for disk space, if nothing else. And that's something that I'm sure Chuck knows all about and can tell us how to do it.
So this last group that we have, this is the last piece for today. So the coming attractions, really, what should we expect? Are we really going to get to a total electronic delivery? Can we do this without fear? Because right now we look at the architects when they issue the models. Some of them have all these disclaimers saying, yes, we created the model, and if you find it reminds me of software disclaimers. If you find a use for it, that's great. If it doesn't work, well, shame on you for having relied on it because we told you it may not be reliable. So can we get past all of that fear and then actually move to a point where we have people actually certifying that the data that's in the model is actually accurate, that it is reliable, that somebody can actually use it for some given purpose?
What is rule-based parametric design, David?
Well, since Chuck's here,
now don't duck it that easy. You're the one that wrote it.
I have to preface this because I work with Stantec. We do a lot of healthcare together, healthcare projects. So an easy way for me to explain this is if you're doing a healthcare design, if it's a hospital and you're working on an OR suite, and you have a room or a suite that you're going to drop into the model, and we'll call it the OR suite. If you drop that OR in there, and if it's a 4-room, 4 OR suite, the fact that it's 4 is enough to determine additional things that go with that OR suite.
Okay.
You have to have a clean corridor. You have to have a service corridor. You have to have support services. You have to have so many gas outlets in each OR itself that just by knowing that it's 4 or by knowing that the size is X.
Well, I'll take it to another place and to go back, because the rule base is that you've established that database of what that OR needs to be, right? So that's where it's linked parametrically. As soon as when we do a project, as soon as we call it an OR, it knows what the finishes are of the room, it knows how many med gas receptacles it has, it knows all the equipment in the room because it's being driven by a database. So that's kind of that rule-based, I would say, database.
Okay, so it's an analogy of, it's analogous to reference details or standard details.
But much more powerful.
But much more powerful. Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right, because it's scalable. The data is scalable.
And you don't forget to leave it out.
Correct.
You don't leave out something by mistake because it's been put in there and tested several times.
Right.
And
So you
here's
can
this diagram that I have drawn to try to show people the difference between uniformat and master format. But really, as I say, they are structured queries, and so we could start the process in uniformat with describing the information in certain ways, and then when it comes into writing, if we are still writing specifications, and certainly contractors find master format more useful for subcontracting, that we push a button and we resort the information according to a different structured query into master format. But then when we get ready to turn the project over to the owner, we can again tell the machine to resort the information according to uniformat, because it's a much more intuitive arrangement of material for facilities management purposes.
I would go one step farther, and we're right at our time, but I would go one step farther and say that if we're going to develop projects relying on BIM, that BIM is really about data and objects being building assembly. And if we're going to be linking the data between the raw data, whether it's specifications or any other data, to these assemblies, it may not make any more sense to make that translation master format.
That may very well be true, and we'll have to see. But as I say, in terms of, as has been brought up by some of our attendees today, how much part one information do we want to put into the model? Does that make it too inefficient, or is it a separate sub file that participates in the model, but it's not the graphic, the parametric stuff? How much part 3 stuff goes in there? Because ultimately the owner is not concerned about either part 1 or part 3. They just care about the part 2 products.
Right, but we're also...
when it comes to facilities management.
But we're by tradition here looking at the current paradigm and trying to link a brand new paradigm to current thinking. And perhaps, just like master format becomes irrelevant, part 1, 2, and 3, and that arrangement of data also becomes irrelevant.
That's
and
true.
We find a brand new way to present the information.
Michael McBitty reminds me that file size is becoming increasingly irrelevant. But I do think that we need to be... but on the other hand... Okay.
So we don't want to wear out our welcome, right?
True.
Okay. So I am trying to look up the date of our next meeting while you're summarizing. How's that?
Okay. Well, we've tried to draw a distinction between data and information, and show how that putting data into some sort of system is enabling us to create information in new ways, to do new things that we could never do before, and provide new opportunities for growth, and new opportunities for those of us who are specifiers. And all of this is going to be very exciting to watch over the next 10 years or so. And stay tuned. We're in for an exciting ride. But the main thing is to keep in mind is we can't look too much towards the past in terms of everything we know is going to be changing in the next 10 years. And so we have to be ready to do that. It's not to say that we don't need to know how to do things correctly right now, but we do need to be thinking constantly, how can I streamline what I'm doing and make it more useful and make it more collaborative. In the meantime, keep those cards and letters coming in, friends and neighbors, so that if you have some ideas about what you'd like us to discuss with you next week.
And I want to say a special thank you to Chuck, first
Yes.
for setting the meeting space for me so that both of us could be here together, and for participating in today. I think it was really valuable for everybody, Chuck. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, really challenging stuff, Chuck. Thanks very much.